Okay, so we are moving right along in Rudolf Steiner's Egyptian Myths and Mysteries, and we're on lecture number 4 here, which is entitled The Experiences of Initiation, the Mysteries of the Planets, the Descent of the Primeval Word, and this was given on September 5th, 1908 in Leipzig. What Steiner does in this chapter then is he picks up the ball where he left off last time with this primordial thought form that the Atlantean initiate would teach to the pupil, that the thought form of the human archetype that first originated on Saturn as these little gleaming scintillae in this primeval mist that contained the seed for what the human being would look like. So he picks up from that, and what he'll do in this chapter is he'll go through 3 different transformations of the ways in which the initiate teaches the pupil on Atlantis, in the first post-Atlantean civilization of India, and then in the third of Egypt. 3 different transformations of the teacher-pupil relationship. So he sort of, in a way, picks up right where he left off, and then he says that, okay, so the Atlantean initiate or teacher has a certain power over the pupil that he's initiating, and he has this thought form to which eventually the human form will conform itself. And he says you have to imagine this as a kind of androgyne, both a male and a female sort of together, like in Plato's myth of the splitting in the Timaeus of human beings who originated together with 2 heads as male, female, and male, to point to the 3 different kinds of sexual relationships that had to be cloven, each of them cloven asunder so that each seeks the other. So it's sort of like that. So the initiate confers to the pupil this image, and then the next step is that now the pupil needs to remember where this image came from, and that it is actually older. It's the oldest thing, unlike the Darwinian myth of evolution, which says that the human comes out of the animal. It's the other way around. And so the Atlantean pupil has to visualize this in his mind as he goes back through the planetary phases of Saturn, Sun, Moon, to the Earth phase that he's in now in Atlantis, and realize that in the Saturn phase, the human was there first. The physical body was first, the human was there first, and it wasn't until the Sun phase that plants came in, and not till the Moon phase that animals came in. So he needs to realize that he would have seen that all the other aspects of creation came out of the human. It wasn't until the Earth phase that the human body solidified, but gained solidity and the ego developed. But nonetheless, it was there as the primordial form, the primordial seed in the Saturn phase. Okay. So now this primordial form then, as we move into India, which is the first of the post-Atlantean civilizations, and the relationship between the teacher, they're called the guru. He doesn't use that term, but would be the guru's relationship to his disciple. And in this case, it would have been Manu. He says, so let's rewind back to the earliest founder of the ancient Indian civilization, which is Manu. And he is teaching the primordial 7 rishis. They are the earliest, the 7 primordial rishis, who actually correspond to the 7 stars of the Big Dipper. I'm not sure that Steiner knows that because he doesn't mention it. He says that the reason there were 7 rishis is because they correspond to the 7 planets, the 7 heavenly bodies. Although in Steiner's model, he has changed them a bit. And so the rishis, each one of the rishis would realize through ascending to this realm on the astral plane called Divashan, which is the highest realm, upper Divashan, which is the realm of the gods. And he would ascend as the teacher was teaching him. He would ascend in this trance state into this higher realm. And each of the initiates would then realize that the fundamental primordial source, prime source energy, let's say Brahman, was carved up into these 7 planetary phases. And here he treats the planets more as phases than as actual physical bodies, but he means both, physical bodies as well as phases, so that there would be one of the initiates that would represent Saturn wisdom, one that would represent Sun wisdom, one for Moon, one for Earth, then one for Jupiter, one for Venus, and one for Vulcan. So those are the names that these initiates had, and each one of them was to conserve knowledge of each of these mystery centers pertaining to his respective planet. So this is why there are 7 of them. And he says that the primordial word, what will later correspond in the Christian tradition to the Logos, the primordial word was called by the ancient Indians Vach, V-A-C, which is the goddess of speech, which it's linked to the Latin word vox for voice. Vach is the Rig Vedic goddess of orality and utterance. She's the equivalent of the muses, the Greek muses, and the Christian Logos. So the word would have descended through the goddess Vach into the minds of each of these rishis so that they can then ascend into Devachan, learn the various aspects of the bodies pertaining to each of these planets and how the subtle bodies were created. And he says that they would realize that the fact that on Saturn the physical body was first, and that between that and the Earth, dealing with the heavy densification on Earth, that there was a gradual process of densification. And Steiner asks, so they would ask, how did this happen? What happened in between Saturn and Earth? And he says, what happened was that the primordial form, that thought form that we saw at the end of the previous chapter and that we started this chapter with, that primordial human archetype, which would later become the seed for the ego, they would see this vision in which the ego had been surrounded by, in Steiner's model, the ego is surrounded by a sheath, an astral sheath. The astral body is a sheath that develops around it, and around that is an external sheath. And Steiner uses the word sheath here. These are the sheaths. He's borrowing from Vedanta. The outer sheath that surrounds the astral body is the etheric body, and then the physical body is a kind of physical sheath that surrounds them, such that through the force of attraction, the astral body compresses on the ego and holds the etheric body together, which then through the force of attraction, the etheric body exerts on the physical body forces that hold the physical body together. And so this is what the initiate would have seen. And Steiner is borrowing his model here clearly from the Vedantic doctrine of the sheaths, in which the idea is that you have the jewel in the lotus, and the jewel is the soul, which is variously known as Atman or Jiva or Purusha. The Jiva, let's say, borrowing from Jainism, the Jiva is at the center, and it is surrounded by concentric sheaths. The outermost sheath, here it starts from the outermost, which is the Annamaya Kosha, the physical body. Anna means food, because everything is eating everything else. And so the Annamaya Kosha is the sheath made of food, but it's animated by a Pranamaya Kosha, which corresponds to Steiner's etheric body, and he even calls it prana in this specific chapter, the etheric body, which is the Pranamaya Kosha, the sheath made of vital forces that contains all the meridians that are treated, in acupuncture and so forth, but that animate and activate the physical outer sheath made of food. And then the inner sheath, which is connected to the Manomaya Kosha, which is the intellect, which is there necessary to register pain or pleasure that the outer body is feeling. And so those three are interconnected, and then there's a gap. And in that gap comes the Vijnanamaya Kosha, which is the sheath made of wisdom, which contains the knowledge that brings plants up out of the earth, grass up out of the ground, beats your heart for you. It's the source of instincts and so forth. So it's the rational, pre-intellectual primordial wisdom that's already been there long before the human neocortex has arrived, very late on the scene. Everything's been going along just fine before the human brain arrived, at least on the physical plane. And then the innermost sheath would be the Anandamaya Kosha, the sheath made of bliss or rapture that is burning through all these other sheaths and bringing them into being endlessly, even though terrible things are happening. And then, of course, in the core would be the Jiva. So at the core for Steiner is what he calls the ego. But as we know, this isn't the Jung's and Freud's ego. This is the self. This is the core that's surrounded by the astral body, the etheric body, and the physical body. And this is what, on ancient India, Manu would have conferred to the rishis, and they would have seen this vision. And they would also have seen the fact that each of the planetary phases has its own special mission. The mission of the Saturn phase being to create the physical body, or at least the outline, sort of invisible X-ray archetype of it, let's say, because it gradually gets dense and it doesn't become solid until Earth. And then that the mission of the Sun was to create life, the life body, the ether body, the life. But the mission of the Moon was to create wisdom. And then finally, the mission of the earth is to create love, is to inherit this wisdom body, the Vijnana-maya-kosha, let's say on a macro scale, the wisdom body that has created the cosmos from all these angelic beings weaving around it, like spiders weaving webs, weaving creation into being. This was the mission: love, to inherit a cosmos made of wisdom and life, and transform it into a cosmos made of love. That's the mission of the earth. So we're about midway through this process of transubstantiating the earth with the help of the Christ event, of course, transubstantiating it into an orb of love, let's say. So this is what the initiate in the first post-Atlantean civilization would have seen, and this is what the relationship between the guru and the pupil would have been in that world. That's the wisdom that would have been imparted. Then he says, now in Egypt, he skips over Persia, doesn't speak about Persia, but he goes straight to Egypt, and he says, now in Egypt, things were a little different, but the Egyptians were still sort of in the situation where the teacher now could impart, could reawaken magical faculties, and there was a kind of magical relationship. Magical forces could emanate in Egypt from the teacher to the pupil, such that the teacher could imagine a thought form, and then through a kind of telepathic radiation, implant it as a picture in the mind of the pupil. This is what Jean Gebser would call the magical consciousness structure, which was still very alive and active in the Egyptian world. And this is how the Egyptian teachers imparted their knowledge to their pupils, was through planting these thought forms telepathically in them. And this is the way it was done, all the way down to the Egyptian civilization. By the time of the fourth post-Atlantean civilization, the Greco-Latin, this knowledge is pretty much lost, and this technique, because of the development in that civilization of the intellectual soul, this technique of magically implanting the image as a thought form or thought picture in the mind of the pupil was lost. Although he makes this funny side comment where he says, although even Socrates had a certain amount still of telepathic abilities, whereby he could sort of put his pupil into a trance, into a hypnotic state, and use the force of his will through his eloquence to sort of plant these thought forms in weak-willed pupils who would inherit them. But he says, other than that, the Greco-Latin civilization pretty much lost this, and we in the West, in the fifth post-Atlantean epoch, have lost this teacher-pupil relationship completely. It no longer exists, of course, because of the intellectual soul, because of Gebser's mental consciousness structure, which has developed and sort of put a wall around the ego that walls out these archaic forms of consciousness and prevents telepathy from happening easily. I suspect everyone has had telepathic experiences. I've had plenty of them in my life. That just where there's a slip, there's an abaissement du niveau mental, as Jung calls it, where there's a lowering of the threshold, and a certain amount of that magic is allowed back in. And he says this is also in Egyptian medicine, and the Egyptian god of medicine would have been Imhotep, which would correspond to the Greek Asclepius. That the god of medicine, they realized that when something went wrong, the Egyptian people would realize this, and how medicine happened was that Steiner says if something goes wrong in the physical body, it's because something has gone. It's not because of some outside influence. It's because something has gone wrong in the etheric body, which in turn because something has gone wrong in the astral body. So he says sleep was an absolutely important aspect of this, and the Atlantean, when he went to sleep, withdrew his astral body and went into the Devashanic worlds, I suppose, and communed with the gods, so that while you are sleeping, the etheric body remains behind, and this is still true even today. The reason we leave the etheric body to go to the astral plane and dreaming is because it allows the etheric body time and space to heal the damage inflicted upon the physical body by the excesses of the astral body during the daytime, which is prone to addiction, passions and desires and excesses and alcoholism and drug abuse, all the things that the astral body falls prey to that damage the physical body. The etheric body has to try and repair it. This is why sleep is so important. It actually helps repair our bodies. And he says that the ancients knew this, and this is why it was very important in Egypt to have what was then called the temple sleep, so that they would put you in a temple, They wouldn't give you any medicine. They would just put you in a temple sacred to the gods so that when you were asleep, the astral body and the ego could lift out of the physical body and commune with the realm of the gods. And from there, they would pour down astral energies into the etheric and physical bodies to repair your body. And I know that this temple sleep was something that lasted for a very long time. The cult of Asclepius had the temple sleep. It was sacred to the cult of Asclepius on the island of Tiber, on the island of Kos, especially on the island of Kos, where we find the remains of places where people were obviously sleeping. I think it could probably be pushed as far back as the island of Malta, where on the island of Malta, which comes from the Neolithic, about 6,000 or 7,000 BC, somewhere in there, that we find statues of goddesses asleep, lying on their side, their head obviously on a pillow or resting on their arm asleep. So clearly the temple sleep is something that was a Mediterranean thing that was going along through the eastern half of the Mediterranean, and the point that demarcates the eastern half is Sicily of the Mediterranean from the western half. So this would have been, even though Malta is a little further, this would have been something that would have been circulating throughout this world, that the idea of the temple sleep and the astral body coming out so that a path is cleared. So he says we've lost this, of course, in the fifth post-Atlantean civilization. We've lost these kinds of treatments, this relationship between, this telepathic relationship between the teacher and the pupil, and also this way that the ancients would have treated through their ancient medicine. They would have laughed at our modern clumsy, awkward techniques for treating individuals with the kind of physicalistic, mineralogical medicine that we have now, which is the reason why Steiner invented, of course, anthroposophical medicine on the one hand and biodynamic farming on the other, which substitutes natural substances in place of chemical fertilizers, multi-crops in place of monocrop agriculture. Steiner understood all these things intuitively and innately. He understood that you could take a cow's horn and stuff manure into it, then plant this into the ground during the winter, and you leave it there during the winter so that the etheric forces of the earth can then work on it, and then you would dig it up in the springtime and then spray that manure on the crops, because it's, in the meantime, it's inherited influences from the planets which are radiating down. He says, by the way, that model of the core of the ego, surrounded by the astral sheath, surrounded by the etheric sheath, surrounded by the physical sheath, is exactly the opposite for the mineral. The mineral, even though it doesn't innately have an etheric body or an astral body, nonetheless is worked on externally instead of internally. In the living being, these forces pull by force of attraction and hold the thing together. Instead, there are pressures exerted on the mineral from without, from the sun. Astral forces stream down on the sun, from the sun, onto the mineral and surround it and compress it, so that it has these astral forces and also etheric forces from the planets that radiate down on the mineral. And so all the pressures are exerted upon the mineral of astral and etheric elements from the sun and the planets from without, since it doesn't have an internal life, an internal consciousness. So it's exactly the opposite. But nonetheless, Steiner always takes into account the influences of the planets on the earth. And biodynamic agriculture takes influence of the fact that the planets are involved with the plants, and that there are certain plants that are more sensitive to certain planets. And this all has to be factored in and taken into account. So Steiner is taking the West's separation and analysis, the transformation of the earth into a dead thing, and the physical body into a dead thing that is anatomized and cut into pieces, and trying to put it all back together again into a single living macrocosmic whole. All right, so that's that chapter, and then we'll move on next to chapter 5.